So, Dr. Harrison, the abortion pill is in the headlines right now for many reasons. The pharmacies that will be dispensing this, you have mail order conversations going on, and this is a big deal in the post-Roe era. But before we get into all of that, can you tell us a little bit about this pill and how it works?
Sure. So the abortion pill is a powerful anti-hormone. It blocks the hormone that allows a woman's body to continue a pregnancy. And when that hormone is blocked, then the woman's body can't feed the baby. But the other important thing that people don't realize is that the hormone has effects all over a woman's body, her brain, her breast. And we have no idea of the long-term consequences of this powerful anti-hormone, especially in teenagers where it's never been tested. So once the anti-hormone works to block the nourishment to the baby, then a second drug is given, misoprostol, cytotec. It's a drug which causes the woman's womb to contract and push out the baby in the placenta, and hopefully that will be the end. But part of the concern is that the way this drug works, the way the first drug, mifepristone, RU46, works, is that it also prevents the woman's womb, the blood vessels in the woman's womb, from contracting. So use of this drug has been associated with massive hemorrhage. I've reviewed some of the adverse event reports sent to the FDA where women have lost over half of their blood volume. Some have lost more than their entire blood volume and had to have more than their entire blood volume replaced to keep up with the massive hemorrhage. So this is the kind of bleeding you see in major motor vehicle accidents. And it's one of the scariest parts of having a mifeprex abortion is that you have this uncontrolled bleeding that can happen afterward. The further in pregnancy, the more likely to have massive uncontrolled bleeding.
And how far along, I know this has changed over the years, but how far along can you be and take this pill to end a pregnancy?
Well, it's never safe. Even at the beginning, it's never safe. But when you take the pill at, say, 7 weeks of pregnancy, that's 3 weeks after you miss your period, you have about a 1 out of 20 chance of needing surgery to complete the abortion. If you're just a couple weeks later, if you're 13 weeks, you have a 1 out of 3 chance of needing surgery. The further along you are in pregnancy, the higher the risk of needing surgery and the higher the risk of massive hemorrhage, because the placenta, the place that interfaces between the baby and the mom, the placenta grows as the baby grows. And so there's more and more blood vessels of the mom's body that are exposed. And when the mifeprex doesn't allow those blood vessels to contract, then you get more bleeding. So it's more and more dangerous as you get further and further in the pregnancy.
You know, it's interesting because you see a lot of people on the pro-choice side acting as though this is very safe. There's nothing to worry about. When you're making something available at a pharmacy, the assumption is that some people might not even go and seek treatment after, right? So you may take the drug at home and who knows what happens from there. Why do you think that this is being pushed so fervently in light of the fact that it's not safe?
Well, I think that some people are so blindly committed to abortion that they refuse to take a look at the actual effects of this drug. And we have many studies that can show abortion drugs or doing an abortion by drugs is at least 4 times more risky than doing an abortion by surgery. So 4 times more complications. And again, the further along, the greater the risk. So when you're blindly committed to something and you refuse to look at the science, then you do all kinds of things that make no medical sense at all.
And about half of pregnancies, correct? I know those numbers are shifting because of the post-Roe era that we're in now, but around half of pregnancies are ended, abortions happen with these drugs, correct?
That's correct. That's correct, according to the latest CDC statistics.
All right, so I want to shift a little bit here, Erik, because you have filed a lawsuit on behalf of Dr. Harrison's organization. There are 3 other medical organizations as well involved in this lawsuit, and it has to do with the FDA purportedly illegally approving these drugs, decades ago. Can you take us through the lawsuit and the aim, what you're hoping to gain?
Sure. We brought this lawsuit because the FDA has been entrusted by Congress to protect the American public from dangerous drugs. But the FDA has failed America's women and girls by approving dangerous chemical abortion drugs. And we're taking the FDA to court because for decades it has stonewalled my clients who are trying to challenge and take these drugs off the marketplace and at least put in protections for women who do take these drugs. So in the year 2000, the FDA approved these drugs against its own rules and regulations, against the statutory requirements, the scientific thresholds that Congress mandated that the FDA follow. And in layman's terms, that means FDA was supposed to study the real world use, how it was going to be approved under the label. But the clinical investigations upon which the FDA relied for these new drugs were completely untethered from reality. They had protections and safeguards for women, ultrasounds, at the beginning, before chemical abortion was performed, and at the end to ensure that there were no fetal parts. Nowhere in the regimen that has been approved since 2000 has the FDA ever required an ultrasound. And they initially at least required 3 doctor's visits. They have now removed all in-person office visits with a doctor. Now they don't even require a doctor to perform the chemical abortion, where you can meet someone who's not a doctor virtually or by telephone or by telemedicine, get the drugs by mail. All this is contrary to longstanding federal criminal law, and we're taking this to court, and we're hopeful and prayerful that the court sees the case the way we have presented it.
You know, it's interesting, Erik, because we're talking here today, obviously, about the recent developments with the abortion pill. And no doubt a lot of this is happening because of Roe going away and Dobbs, you know, the court passing Dobbs and everything we've seen happen in the last, 6 months, that this is going to be stepped up in many different areas of the country. But what do you think motivated, going back to the year 2000, what do you think motivated the FDA to take that position again on such a massive issue?
What we have seen since the beginning is the FDA choosing and prioritizing politics over science. This was approved in the last waning months of the Clinton administration. The next time we saw big changes to the regimen, it was in the waning months of the Obama administration. And what happened in the last few years? The Biden administration took over and they put their political pressure and the thumb on the scale on politics over science. And so what we're seeing is the politicization of science here over and over again to the detriment of women and girls' health.
Now, Dr. Harrison, I'm coming back to you here. What would you say, because this is one of those interesting issues where you have doctors who have very different perspectives on this. What would you say to those doctors who have just co-signed this, jumped on board, and who are agreeing that these pills should be doled out at pharmacies and through the mail?
I would suggest that they look at the medical literature, that they look at the research, which shows that these drugs are much more dangerous than a surgical abortion. And then I'd suggest that they think about the implications of a woman having an abortion when no one, or a woman taking these drugs when no one has made sure that she doesn't have an ectopic pregnancy. No one has made sure that how far along she is. So without knowing how far along she is, you can't possibly give her informed consent. She can't possibly know her risks unless she knows whether she's 7 weeks or 13 weeks. And no one is checking her for a specific blood type, which is Rh negative, like O negative or B negative or A negative. A woman with that blood type has to have a medicine called Rogam. The medicine called Rogam is given every time she has an abortion, a miscarriage, or a delivery. And that is to allow her to have future pregnancies without complications. If she doesn't get that Rogam, she may not be able to carry another child. So these things, and an ectopic pregnancy, let me explain that a little bit. An ectopic pregnancy is a condition where the pregnancy plants itself implants outside the uterus. And when that happens, then the tube where the ectopic pregnancy has planted will stretch only to a certain point, and after that it will rupture. Well, mifepristone, the abortion drug, does not treat ectopic pregnancies. So what happens, and what has happened in several women, is that they've taken this drug and they've had intense pain and bleeding, which they thought was a normal part of a mifepristone abortion. And indeed it is, intense pain and bleeding. But what was really happening in their body is their tube was rupturing and they died from hemorrhage, internal hemorrhage, because nobody had done an ultrasound to rule out ectopic pregnancy. That is medical malpractice. Write the check. And
Wow.
Yet we are now allowing women without any kind of medical screening and without any kind of medical supervision to take these drugs at home And who's going to care for them? Who's going to care for their complications when they receive the drugs by mail from maybe even a non-physician in another state? Who's going to take care of them when they're hemorrhaging in their bathroom? I mean, this is medical malpractice in any other area of medicine. And yet with abortion, we turn a blind eye to it.
Just final question for you here. What sort of tracking is going on or is planned or has happened, right? We're talking about these cases of women who would take these drugs to end a pregnancy. Do we have any does the government collect data? Do they plan to collect data so that we can actually discern what the impact of this drug is on women?
No, there is no systematic tracking at this point. When the drug was initially approved, FDA told the manufacturer, you have to track the complications from this drug. But the manufacturer only has contact with the abortionist. And we know from studies that we've done that over half the complications are in the emergency room and not handled by the abortionist. We also know that some abortionists are telling women to lie about when they go to the emergency room with a complication, to say, oh, I'm just miscarrying, and not to tell people that they're having a complication from mifepristone. And then the third thing that we know is with all of that, we've looked at the adverse event reports submitted to the FDA and compared them with adverse event reports submitted elsewhere for publication. And what you find is that the FDA only has a fraction of reports that are published elsewhere. And then when we legally requested the FDA to give us those reports, they only gave us a fraction of those reports. But those reports that they did give us tell a story of massive hemorrhage and infection. Women have died of infections from a rare soil bacteria, but because mifepristone and misoprostol suppress the immune system, that makes women vulnerable to infections. So women are dying of infections, they're dying of hemorrhage. And this is a huge problem, a huge complication that the FDA stopped tracking in 2016 when they changed the label and went from 3 visits down to 1 visit. Then they told the manufacturer, oh, you don't have to track complications anymore. You can just track deaths. But the abortionists have no way to track the deaths. In fact, in some of the adverse event reports, we saw a report from an abortionist that said, well, I saw the woman's obituary in a local newspaper, so I assume she died. This is abysmal. This is, like I said, medical malpractice in any other area of medicine.
Well, and I have a feeling.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I have a feeling we're going to be talking about this for quite a while to come as well, because I think this is just going to be kicking up into high gear, the use of these drugs. Continue. I apologize.
No, you're exactly right. So what I was going to say is one of the most ironic statements maybe in history that I've ever read was when the FDA said that they were allowing these virtual visits for with no in-person checking, no in-person supervision. They were allowing these medical visits because they had reviewed the adverse event reports from 2020 to 2021, that range, and they found no change in the adverse event reports. But these are adverse event reports that only report deaths and didn't track the complications since 2016. It's just, you couldn't make this stuff up. It's just amazing that we have such duplicity, such scientific duplicity on the part of the FDA. It's unbelievable.
Final question to you, Erik. As I know the case was recently filed, what are the next steps? Where do things go from here in that legal battle?
We asked the court for expedited review of our claims. And so the next step is the government's going to respond next week, Friday the 13th. And then we are going to finish briefing in February. And hopefully the court will hear our case and decide shortly thereafter. But we're asking the court to take these drugs off the marketplace.
Well, I want to, thank you both for taking the time to help us understand this. This is a complicated issue. There's a lot going on here, and we'll be visiting back with you and tracking as the case unfolds. Thanks for your time.
Thank you
very much.